RPGs.
RPG on the ridge!
No, not those RPGs. I'm talking about this RPG and that RPG. Role-playing video games have been loosely defined in the video game industry to signify that the game might have an open world or even a garbage skill tree or even a sorry excuse for a character customization. Video games now use this as almost a marketing tactic to put on the label of RPG because of sales of games just like Witcher 3 or even Skyrim. But this can actually alter the definition of what an RPG actually is. So let's actually go over to my office and have a discussion of why your game is not an RPG. So let's talk about this real quick. Let's talk about first defining what a role-playing game actually is, because we won't know that your game is not an RPG if we don't know what an RPG actually is. So the history of the RPG actually goes into the 1980s, right after the video game crash with E.T. and too many video games coming out. And now we're starting to see a resurgence, guess you can say, but a resurgence of video games, but a much more intentional value behind them come into play. Role-playing video games. Back in the 1980s, we've seen basement-dwelling dweebs wanting a storytelling experience that they had with tabletop RPG games, and they wanted them on these newfangled machines that you could play games on called video game consoles. They were coming into the homes, they were actually becoming part of the mainstream, and they wanted to put them on these machines. And therefore, we got role-playing video games from these role-playing tabletop games. We got games such as Rogue, which to this day, we actually describe games as, which if you ever heard a game, rogue-like game, or even a rogue-lite game, it's actually going back to the 1980s original RPG called Rogue, and that's where we get the definition from. But we also got the very first role-playing game, which is called Dragon Stomper, and actually a good amount of Dungeons & Dragons video games. They actually did a good amount of them, but that's because they wanted games like Dungeons & Dragons on video game consoles. So what actually is a role-playing video game? You might ask. I don't know. So I would say the most prominent definition we can take from role-playing video games is what you get from a role-playing tabletop game is that you are in control of the story and you are playing the role of a certain character and you get to set the traits of that certain character. You get to set the paths that this character takes because you are in the role of a character. Thereby, you are a role-playing game, whether it be on tabletop like Dungeons and Dragons. I'm sorry, I can't come up with more examples other than Dungeons and Dragons. I'm sorry, I'm not really a tabletop gamer. Oh no. Really, you're actually taking on the role of that character and thereby making a role-playing game. Even in video games, when you are taking part in a role-playing video game, you are setting the character up to the character customization to look more like you, to the traits that they will take on, to the paths they will take, to the background that they take. It's all about the control that you put into the story, the narrative, the world building is all about what you make of it. And that's what a role-playing game actually is. While there are many genres of RPGs, like action RPGs, MMO RPGs, turn-based RPGs, Japanese role-playing games, Western RPGs. There's all these single, genres of RPGs, but they all have to follow the same principle of what an RPG actually is, which is you taking control of the story and the narrative and you taking on the role and you taking on the traits, the paths, everything. They have to have that same principle. Otherwise, you can call anything an RPG. You can literally just say anything's an RPG because there's no principles involved. So if you don't have the same principles involved, the same definitions, anything that sets the standard of what an RPG actually is, that goes into chaos. It goes into anything that you talk about. If you don't have a set definition of what a pizza actually is, then you can just lie to the public and call flatbreads pizzas, okay? That's not true. But you know what is true? Pineapples belong on pizza. Get over it, people. Pineapples on pizza for president in 2024. We're calling it here, people. My point in this whole chapter, or chapter 1 of this video, is that we need to know what the actual definition is. Otherwise, the lines will be blurred into other genres of video games. I would say, for an example, that adventure games get blurred into the lines of an RPG. Sometimes adventure games can get to be saying like, oh, that's an RPG, much like Red Dead Redemption. That was, kind of lumped into an RPG because people saw it as an open world. There's character customization. There's all this stuff. And we're going to get into Horizon Zero Dawn in just a little bit, but don't get ahead of me now, George. But my point is that you start blurring the lines here. You start to say that adventure games are actually RPGs, or RPGs are just, fancy adventure games. The lines begin to blur, but we need to have set standards of what RPGs are, or we don't blur the line. Is this important? Is this going to affect the life that you live? Probably not, but I just want to make sure that you know what an RPG is. So I'm not trying to say that it's illegal to make your adventure game into an RPG, or even put RPG mechanics in it. I'm not saying that it's beyond immoral to say that an adventure game is an RPG. But what I think we need to figure out, though, is that what will you have control over in your game that you just purchased for $60 and now soon to be $70? You want to know what you're getting into. And there's a vast difference between adventure games and RPGs that you will not have control over. And for fans of RPGs, if you give them an adventure game, they're going to be very much disappointed, but I still think that adventure games have their place. So instead of me just talking about blurred lines and all that, let's actually get into chapter 2 now, which is talking about what's actually the difference between adventure games and role-playing games. So adventure games and role-playing games actually are pretty similar when it comes down to it in terms of world building, narratives, even to customizations at times where you can actually customize your character. And a lot of times that adventure games will be placed into RPGs because the lines begin to blur and you don't know what it is. And people whatever. And people start to think that these are just broad terms, RPG, action, adventure game, it's all the difference. But let's point this out here. The major difference between adventure games and role-playing games is that in a role-playing game, you are the character. You set the rules. You are the traits. You are the character in the game. In an adventure game, on the other hand, you are merely taking control of a set character with set traits and a set narrative. Both can have, I should say, long narratives. Of course, they can have a long story-driven game. They can both have open worlds. They can both have skill trees for all I care. But the main difference here is that adventure games will have you taking place of the set character, but some games will use RPG mechanics and call themselves an RPG. Take, for example, and this is neither an RPG or an adventure game, but NBA 2K17 was once touted as the best sports RPG out there. And what they meant by that was there's a character customization and even a skill tree, but that doesn't mean that it's an RPG. And it didn't even mean that it was an adventure game. It had RPG mechanics. Same thing with adventure games. Sometimes adventure games can have RPG mechanics, and that's fine. That's well and good. Doesn't mean it's an RPG. The best adventure games you can think of are, some to the likes of Uncharted, or even, and we'll get to in a minute, Horizon Zero Dawn, which, kind of toes the line between the two. Or even, as I said before, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a perfect example of an adventure game. Red Dead Redemption 2 takes place, with a wide open world in the Midwest, the southern states. You take the role of, and you're taking the role of Arthur Morgan. You are not the character, but you are taking control of the story of Arthur Morgan and his journey. It is a set story. There may be choices here and there, but you're not really setting the place of what the story will become, but you're merely taking the role of Arthur Morgan, where with RPGs, you would be the character. You would be the nameless character. You would be, in my case, I would be Adam Evalt in the whole southern states. Great, fantastic, cool. But if we're calling these adventure games RPGs, RPG fans will be disappointed. Going back to Red Dead Redemption 2, if you tell a huge RPG fan coming to the likes of Divinity or even Elder Scrolls or even, let's go to Bethesda again, Fallout, original Fallout. We're not talking Fallout 4 here. Also toes the line between adventure and RPG. Fight me. But what I am saying is that if you give a true fan of an RPG genre, Red Dead Redemption 2, and you say, this is a really good RPG, they're going to be severely disappointed because they're not taking control of the story. Now, you might be saying to yourself,
Adam, are you saying that adventure games are a lesser version of an RPG? Are you saying that, adventure games are just a crappier version of an RPG?
Let me put this out here. I'm going to lose somebody here. I'm sorry. I like adventure games better than RPGs. Sue me. Oh no, I'm in court now. I like adventure games a lot better because for me personally, I like seeing the role that each character has. I like seeing that set story. I like taking part in a huge open world, but I don't need to choose where my path goes or what ending I need to do or what thing I need to grind for or skill tree or traits, blah, 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 blah. But I like adventure games because I'm a huge movie buff. I love watching film, and adventure games, give me that role in a movie essentially, and they let me take a role of a character in that movie. And I like seeing that set story. I like seeing where the narrative writer is taking me. Versus an RPG, I have to choose the story. I have to pretty much make the story. There is narrative writing involved in an RPG, and a lot more skillfully because there's a lot of different paths that you have to write for, but I like adventure games for what they are. And that's my point in this. And that's my point in this chapter, is to say that it depends of what you like. Do you want full control of a story in a game? Go for actual RPGs. Go for a textbook definition of role-playing video games. Do you just like movies? Do you like watching a character grow? Do you want to take part? Do you want to be the shadow of a character? Then go for adventure games. Go for games like, Uncharted and Red Dead Redemption 2 and Horizon Zero Dawn, which we'll get to in the next chapter. Hold on there, Paul. Your name's Paul now. But that's my point in this. I don't think we should come down on developers for making role-playing games. But what I am saying is that when you do make a game, make sure that you know what kind of game you're doing, because in the end, you're just going to disappoint people for what they can or cannot control. So let me take this to the final chapter now. Let's discuss the final piece here. With blurred lines comes sales pitches. With these blurred lines comes, set standards that advertisers will use because blurred lines, and they can just label things the way they want them to, and people will buy it. So in my final chapter here, I want to talk about the sales pitches that you will be taking and why role-playing games are actually just sales pitches and why that is. Lately, we've seen a change in RPG games. Lately, we've seen RPGs just put on a game just to entice players to buy into it. Why is that? Is it because of sales of The Witcher 3 and Skyrim, where The Witcher 3, had vast sales and Skyrim is, selling on every single console that will ever come out, including your microwave? Partially, yes. I think some of that is to blame on those games. But I think there's one thing that we're missing of why that people in advertising want to sell their game as an RPG. And there's one word that I want you to think of. Immersion. We've already defined role-playing games as giving you a level of immersion that no other genre in video game industries can ever give you. And that is the immersion of putting you in the story and putting you into control and putting you as part of the world building. And while all this is great, I think RPGs can be fantastic. It's great. but not every time. I don't think every video game needs to have this mood, this setting, this aspect, this level of immersion. While RPG memories can last a lifetime because you were part of the world building, sometimes you just want to play a nice platformer. Sometimes you just want to play an adventure game. Sometimes you just want to play a sneaky stealth game. What I'm trying to say here is that if you're just labeling your game as a role-playing game just to make sure people know that there's a level of immersion that no other game can give you, I think that's a mistake, because not every video game needs to immerse you in that sort of level. Yes, video games do have the power over movies to give you full control of the narrative. And yes, there are some criticisms of certain games that might be too linear or become a walking sim, much like Firewatch and Dear Esther, and those criticisms become that that's not really a video game. But here's the thing, those opinions are completely subjective. I myself love Firewatch. I loved Dear Esther. I loved Gone Home. I liked Gone Home. And then I played it again. And then I loved Gone Home. But my point is that you can't just say that you have to have a level of immersion or not let it be linear. Don't let your video game become a movie, or else it doesn't become a video game, because those opinions are subjective. Like any piece of art, like any piece of media, there are preferences, there are groups, there are genres, and there are people within that group and genre that prefer to play certain things or watch certain things in a certain way. And if you build your game around that set genre, people will come to it. People will flock to it. If you want to make a true natural RPG, lovers will go to it. If you want to make a true textbook RPG, people will go to it. Or if you just want to make a walking sim game or a stealth game or a platformer game, you don't need to put RPG elements. People who like platformers will go to it. There are always genres and preferences. And if you start to say that this game is a platformer, but also RPG, but also if you start to Frankenstein things, that's where the blurred lines begins, and that's where the sales pitches comes in, and you're not trusting an audience to come to your game. Those blurred lines will now lump into different things and will not give any genre true meaning of what a set textbook thing within that genre is. Flatbreads aren't pizzas. Get over it, Linda.
Linda, listen.
So let's stop blurring the lines between adventure games and RPGs, because that way these are just vague statements. You can just plaster RPG on a sports title and call it a day. You can just say this is an action adventure game and just call it a day. Let's not make these vague statements anymore. Let's actually give them meaning behind the name. Create the world that you want to build. Put in the features that you want to put in, or don't put in the features that you don't want to put in. Make it as linear or as open as you want to. Don't be afraid of just picking out one single audience, because that audience will come to your game. And I know there's investors out there that are looking at RPGs and they're saying that this is what sells, you need to make it an RPG. But I think that's why we're seeing a lot of veterans in studios such as BioWare, or even such things as Bioware, or maybe even BioWare. I'm talking about Mark Dara and Casey Hudson just leaving BioWare. Yikes. But that's why we're seeing these huge veterans going into different roles. We're starting to see that they're getting out of these things and they want to create their own type of game. And the last point I want to make, and I've been going over this over and over again, is Horizon Zero Dawn. This is a game that's set as a role-playing game, but it's merely an adventure game. Before I leave, I already talked about how Horizon Zero Dawn is kind of towing the line, and it does. Guerrilla Games defined Horizon Zero Dawn as an RPG, and it does have dialogue circles, it does have branching paths, it does have, a wide open world. But if we really boil down to what an adventure game is that you are taking a set character with set traits, going on a set story, a set path. Horizon Zero Dawn actually leans towards an adventure game. But I think to market it as an RPG, they were setting up that, no, look, you have control over the story. You have this immersion. But I don't think it would have been a bad thing to call that game an adventure game. I don't think it would have been a bad thing to say it was an action-adventure game. I don't think it would have been bad if you took away dialogue circles. But Horizon Zero Dawn is still a great game. Horizon Zero Dawn can even be defined as an RPG if you really wanted to. But it's not a textbook RPG. And that's my point in all of this. Make the game that you want to make. And if you end up with a game that doesn't have any branching paths, it doesn't have any dialogue circles, it doesn't have any of these things that an RPG would have, that's fine. Release it the way it is. Your game is not an RPG, and that's fine. So those are just my thoughts about role-playing video games. Definition behind it, the mistakes we kind of make. And it's not a bad thing that some games want to be a role-playing game. It's just that, maybe we should just let role-playing games just be role-playing games and not just take mechanics and call it an RPG. So this is the first video of the Evalt channel. Thanks for coming on for it. If you're so inclined to, definitely hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you know when all these videos come out. This channel is going to be videos just like this. So if you enjoyed it, stick around and click subscribe. And if you did enjoy it, click that like button and share it with a friend or family or even your enemies. They need it too. So thanks again for coming around. We hope to have you in the next one, and I'll catch you on that one. Bye. Get out of my studio. Goodbye. See ya.